Some names were whispered in medieval darkness for reasons history forgot. Tonight, we descend into the shadows of antiquity, where power and madness dance together in ways that would make modern psychologists weep. Before forensic science, before criminal profiles, before anyone understood the human mind's capacity for calculated evil, there walked among kings and nobles individuals whose appetites transcended normal human boundaries. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. These were methodical, ritualistic, and disturbingly creative expressions of something far darker. So before you settle into tonight's journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these explorations into history's forgotten corners. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your world. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all here together, sharing these ancient secrets across time zones and continents. Now dim the lights. Perhaps light a candle whose flame can flicker like those that once illuminated castle walls where terrible things happened. Turn on that gentle fan for background noise, and let's ease into tonight's unsettling but strangely peaceful exploration together. But the most important part of this story hasn't been told yet. In the Loire Valley of 15th century France, where morning mist still clings to ancient stone and centuries-old secrets whisper through the wind, stood the imposing fortress of Machecoul. Its walls had witnessed the 100 Years' War, the rise and fall of kingdoms, and the daily rhythms of medieval life. But within those walls, something else entirely was taking shape. Something that would make even the most hardened soldiers of that brutal age cross themselves and look away. The year was 1440, and Gilles de Rais was not yet a monster in the eyes of history. To most, he was still Marshal of France, hero of Orléans, companion in arms to Joan of Arc herself. His wealth was legendary. Gold flowed through his hands like water, and his parties were spoken of from Paris to Rome. Nobles traveled weeks just to witness the extravagance of his feasts, where hundreds of guests dined on delicacies that cost more than most peasants would see in 10 lifetimes. Can you picture yourself walking through those torch-lit corridors, your footsteps echoing against stone worn smooth by centuries? The air would smell of wood smoke, roasted meat, and something else, something indefinable that made visitors unconsciously quicken their pace past certain doorways. Even in an age when violence was commonplace and death a frequent visitor, there was something about Machecoul that felt different, darker. The servants whispered, as servants always do, but their whispers carried a weight that made even the bravest knights uncomfortable. Children from the surrounding villages had begun to vanish with disturbing frequency. At first, parents assumed wolves or disease, both common tragedies in that harsh time. But when the local priests began blessing their doors nightly and mothers started keeping their sons close even during daylight hours, even the most rational minds began to wonder. What exactly was happening behind those fortress walls? Gilles de Rais had discovered something about power that most nobles never explored: physical dominance over armies, political influence over kingdoms. These were merely the appetizers to a much richer feast. The true delicacy was absolute control over life itself, the godlike authority to decide not just who lived or died, but how they experienced their final moments. In his private chambers, far from the great halls where minstrels sang and wine flowed, Gilles was conducting experiments that would have made ancient Roman emperors pause with admiration. The process was always methodical. Young boys from poor families, those whose disappearance might be noticed but rarely investigated, would be invited to the castle under various pretenses. employment opportunities, religious instruction, or simply the promise of a hot meal and warm bed. Their parents, desperate and hopeful, would watch their children walk toward those imposing gates, never imagining they were saying goodbye forever. But what happened next wasn't mere murder. That would have been too simple, too crude for someone of Gilles' sophistication. He had studied the texts of ancient Rome, where emperors like Caligula had elevated sadism to an art form. He understood that true power wasn't in the taking of life, but in the methodical destruction of hope, the careful orchestration of terror, and the intellectual appreciation of another's complete helplessness. The candles in his private chambers burned with a strange, sweet scent, a mixture of beeswax and something else that his servants learned never to question. The walls were decorated not with typical noble tapestries, but with curious instruments whose purposes weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. To most visitors, they appeared to be either religious artifacts or perhaps unusual surgical tools. Both assumptions contained elements of truth, though neither captured the full reality. As autumn nights grew longer in 1440, the disappearances accelerated. What had begun as an occasional tragedy became a pattern so obvious that even the most politically cautious bishops began asking uncomfortable questions. But Gilles de Rais was not merely a wealthy noble. He was a war hero, a marshal of France, a man whose influence reached directly to the royal court. Who would dare accuse such a figure of anything more serious than excessive spending on his theatrical productions? Yet the real tragedy was still approaching its crescendo. But I haven't told you about the woman who made even Gilles seem merciful. 500 miles east, in the misty peaks of Hungary's Carpathian Mountains, another name was beginning to echo through castle corridors and village squares. Elizabeth Bathory, born into a family where madness and brilliance had intertwined for generations, was discovering that the privileges of noble birth extended far beyond fine clothing and political marriages. The Bathory family castle of Chaktiche rose from its mountaintop like a stone finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. Even in daylight, its towers cast shadows that seemed to move independently of the sun's path. Local peasants had learned to time their travel so they would never find themselves on the mountain roads after dark, not because of wolves or bandits, but because of something far more calculating that hunted from within those ancient walls. Elizabeth was not yet 20 when she made her first discovery about the relationship between beauty and suffering. The year was 1575, and she had just married Ferenc Nadasti, known throughout Hungary as the Black Knight for his brutality against Turkish invaders. Their wedding was a celebration that lasted 3 days, attended by nobility from across Eastern Europe. But it was on the 4th night, in the privacy of their new shared chambers, that Elizabeth learned something about herself that would define the next 4 decades of her existence. A servant girl, barely 16, with hair like spun gold and skin that seemed to glow in candlelight, had accidentally splashed hot wax from a dripping candle onto Elizabeth's hand while helping her prepare for bed. The pain was sharp but brief, yet Elizabeth's reaction was anything but proportional. In a moment of pure fury, she struck the girl across the face with such force that blood spurted from the servant's nose, several drops landing on Elizabeth's pale wrist. What happened next would be debated by scholars and psychologists for centuries to come. As Elizabeth absently wiped the blood from her skin, she became convinced that wherever the girl's blood had touched, her flesh appeared more youthful, more radiant. Whether this was reality, suggestion, or simply the particular way candlelight played across blood-dampened skin, Elizabeth believed she had stumbled upon a secret that wealthy women had been seeking since the dawn of civilization. The servant girl disappeared that very night. The official story involved a family emergency in a distant village, but the other servants noticed that her bed remained unslept in, her belongings untouched. More unsettling was the strange contentment that seemed to emanate from their new mistress in the days that followed. Elizabeth's complexion appeared luminous, her energy boundless, her appetite for all pleasures notably increased. Can you imagine walking through those carpeted halls, hearing the soft whisper of silk against stone, breathing air perfumed with roses and something darker? Ferencz's frequent military campaigns provided the perfect cover for Elizabeth's evolving interests. While her husband earned glory battling Ottoman forces, she was conducting her own campaigns within the castle walls. Her methods became increasingly sophisticated as her confidence grew. What had begun as spontaneous violence evolved into carefully planned theatrical productions, each one more elaborate than the last. She established what she called her Academy for Young Ladies, a finishing school where peasant girls of unusual beauty could learn the refined manners necessary for service in noble households. Parents from across the region, desperate to provide their daughters with opportunities beyond subsistence farming, would travel for days to deliver their most precious children to this apparent blessing. The irony was breathtaking in its cruelty. They were paying for the privilege of feeding their daughters to a monster. The selection process itself became a ritual that Elizabeth savored almost as much as what followed. Girls would be evaluated not just for physical beauty, but for the quality of their fear, the timbre of their voices when confused or frightened, the particular shade of terror in their eyes when they realized their mistake. Elizabeth developed in connoisseurs' appreciation for the subtle variations in human despair, the way panic manifested differently in the naturally bold versus the inherently timid. The basement chambers of Choctaw Castle were renovated with the same attention to detail that other nobles devoted to their libraries or music rooms. Temperature and humidity were carefully controlled to prevent rapid decomposition. Drainage systems were installed with Germanic engineering precision. Special tables were constructed to very specific heights and dimensions, with restraints that could maintain their subjects in optimal positions for extended periods without allowing the unconsciousness that would spoil Elizabeth's enjoyment. Yet even this was merely preparation for what she discovered during the winter of 1578. But the real masters of methodical murder wore laurel crowns and ruled empires. 2 millennia before European nobles discovered the artistic possibilities of systematic murder, Rome had already perfected the integration of sadism and state power. The year was 37 AD, and a young man named Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, had just ascended to become the most powerful individual in the known world. The Roman Forum bustled with its daily commerce, senators debated with practiced eloquence, and citizens went about their business secure in the knowledge that they lived at the heart of civilization's greatest achievement. None suspected that their new emperor was about to demonstrate that absolute power could transform even the most promising individual into something that challenged the very definition of humanity. Caligula's transformation didn't happen overnight. For the first 6 months of his reign, he was everything Rome had hoped for: generous with public games, respectful to the Senate, and apparently devoted to the memory of his beloved predecessor, Tiberius. Citizens celebrated in the streets, convinced that after years of Tiberius's increasingly paranoid rule, they finally had an emperor who would restore Rome's glory and dignity. But what they didn't understand was that something had been awakening in Caligula's mind since childhood. Growing up in military camps along the Germanic frontier, Young Gaius had witnessed violence that would traumatize most adults. He had seen enemy prisoners tortured for information, watched executions carried out with casual efficiency, and observed how quickly human beings could be reduced from proud warriors to whimpering animals. But unlike other children who were horrified or at least disturbed by such displays, Caligula found them fascinating from an intellectual perspective. He began to understand that conventional morality was simply a social convention, no more binding on those with real power than etiquette rules at a dinner party. If strength was what ultimately determined survival, and if he possessed the ultimate strength as Emperor of Rome, then what possible moral authority could challenge his desires? The realization was liberating in a way that his tutors had never intended when they taught him about power and responsibility. The first sign of change came during the gladiatorial games he sponsored in his 8th month as emperor. Traditional games followed established patterns: professional fighters battling with skill and honor, occasional executions of convicted criminals, perhaps some exotic animal hunts to entertain the crowds. But Caligula introduced innovations that left even hardened Roman audiences unsettled. He began selecting spectators from the crowd, not criminals or volunteers, but ordinary citizens, and forcing them into the arena against professional gladiators. His reasoning was impeccable from a certain twisted perspective. If Romans truly appreciated martial valor, shouldn't they welcome the opportunity to demonstrate it personally? The terror in their eyes as they realized their situation wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding, but a deliberate choice by their emperor provided Caligula with a satisfaction he found increasingly addictive. Picture yourself in the emperor's private box, marble columns framing your view of the sand-covered arena below. The Mediterranean sun beats down relentlessly, and the crowd's roar echoes off stone walls built to last millennia. But instead of the familiar rhythms of professional combat, you're witnessing something unprecedented: a prosperous merchant trying to defend himself with an unfamiliar sword against a gladiator who has killed dozens of men. The merchant's wife and children watch from the stands, forbidden to leave, forced to witness what their emperor has chosen for their husband and father. What would you do if you realized the emperor's eyes were on you, evaluating whether you might make an interesting addition to tomorrow's entertainment? The palace itself became Caligula's primary laboratory for exploring the boundaries of human endurance and degradation. The Palatine Hill, where Augustus had established the tradition of imperial residence and tasteful modesty, was transformed into something that combined the functions of a government center, pleasure palace, and torture facility. Rooms that had once hosted diplomatic receptions were modified with fixtures whose purposes weren't immediately obvious to casual visitors, but became terrifyingly clear to those selected for closer examination. Caligula's dinner parties became legendary throughout the empire, but not for their culinary sophistication or political significance. Guests would arrive expecting the usual mixture of fine food, intellectual conversation, and careful political positioning, but found themselves participants in theatrical productions that challenged every assumption they held about civilized behavior. The emperor had discovered that the most exquisite pleasure came not from causing physical pain — any torturer could accomplish that — but from watching as his guests' moral certainties crumbled in real time. He would, for example, invite a senator to dine along with the man's teenage son, engaging in pleasant conversation about literature and philosophy while servants prepared courses with unusual care. Only gradually would it become apparent that the evening's entertainment involved the senator choosing which of his family members would survive until morning. The psychological torture was exquisite in its sophistication. Refuse to choose, and all would die slowly. Make a choice, and live forever with the knowledge of your decision, while watching your emperor's satisfied smile. But the true artistry was yet to come. The imperial villa at Capri, inherited from Tiberius, provided Caligula with a more private venue for his most ambitious projects. The island's isolation meant that screams wouldn't disturb anyone of importance, while the natural beauty of the Mediterranean setting provided an almost surreal contrast to the activities taking place within the villa's carefully designed chambers. However, none of them understood precision, like the prince who planted forests of the dying. In the mist-shrouded peaks of 15th-century Wallachia, where the Carpathian Mountains divide civilized Europe from the Ottoman wilderness, a different kind of artist was perfecting techniques that would echo through nightmares for centuries. Vlad III, known to his contemporaries as Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, approached systematic murder with the methodical precision of a master craftsman combined with the strategic vision of a military genius. The year was 1456, and Vlad had just reclaimed his father's throne after years of exile, captivity, and careful study of his enemy's methods. Unlike the aristocratic sadists of Western Europe who pursued their hobbies in private, Vlad understood that terror could be a tool of statecraft more powerful than armies or gold. His education in psychological warfare had come from masters. The Ottoman court, where he'd been held hostage, had taught him that the anticipation of suffering could be more effective than suffering itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the plains outside Târgoviște, Vlad's capital, but these weren't the familiar shadows of trees or buildings. Instead, a forest of wooden stakes stretched as far as the eye could see, each one crowned with a human figure in various stages of decay. This was Vlad's message to the world, a diplomatic communication more eloquent than any written treaty, more persuasive than any negotiated agreement. Can you imagine being a foreign ambassador, approaching that city, watching that forest grow larger with each step your horse takes? The beauty of impalement, from Vlad's perspective, lay not in its cruelty, but in its efficiency and precision. Unlike other forms of execution that ended matters quickly, impalement allowed for extended periods of contemplation, both for the victim and for observers. A properly positioned stake could keep a person alive for hours or even days, providing ample time for reflection on whatever choices had led them to their current circumstances. Vlad's craftsmen became artists in their own right, developing techniques that maximized both duration and psychological impact. The stakes had to be carefully prepared, too sharp, and death came too quickly, too dull, and the process became merely crude rather than sophisticated. The optimal diameter varied based on the victim's size and the message being sent. The angle of insertion required mathematical precision to avoid vital organs, while ensuring that gravity would inevitably complete the process. The positioning of the stakes themselves became a form of landscape architecture that served multiple purposes. Arranged in specific patterns, they created lanes and avenues through which visitors had to walk, ensuring maximum exposure to Vlad's message. The height variations meant that some victims remained conscious and able to observe others in various stages of their own progression, creating a community of shared experience that transcended normal social boundaries. Foreign diplomats were always given guided tours of what Vlad called his garden of contemplation. Their horses would be led slowly along designated paths, while interpreters explained the significance of various displays. This person had been a corrupt tax collector. That one had violated a trade agreement. Another had shown insufficient respect for Wallachian sovereignty. Each stake told a story, and collectively they formed an epic narrative about the consequences of challenging Vlad's vision of proper order. But what visitors rarely understood was that the garden served another purpose entirely. The selection process for Vlad's garden revealed the true sophistication of his psychological warfare. Unlike random executions that might terrorize temporarily, but ultimately could be dismissed as arbitrary cruelty, Vlad's choices followed clear patterns that demonstrated both the reach of his intelligence network and the consistency of his moral code. Merchants who cheated customers, officials who accepted bribes, soldiers who mistreated civilians, nobles who plotted against the state, all found their way to the garden through a judicial process that was transparently fair, even as it was implacably harsh. This combination of absolute predictability with inevitable punishment created a psychological environment where Vlad's subjects began to police themselves. Why risk corruption when the consequences were so clearly displayed? Why plot rebellion when the garden demonstrated the fate of previous conspirators? The forest of stakes became a form of social conditioning more effective than any system of laws or religious moral instruction. During the winter months, when new executions were less frequent, Vlad would often walk among the stakes at twilight, accompanied only by a small guard detail. Local peasants claimed they could sometimes see his silhouette moving between the wooden towers like a gardener inspecting his crops. These solitary tours weren't acts of morbid fascination, but careful quality assessments, evaluating which techniques had proven most effective, which arrangements had generated the optimal psychological response from different audiences. The record-keeping was meticulous. Each execution was documented not just with the victim's name and crime, but with detailed observations about their behavior during the process, the reactions of witnesses, and the broader political or social impact. Vlad understood that he was conducting a vast experiment in applied psychology, and like any careful researcher, he maintained comprehensive notes for future reference and refinement. Yet even his most ambitious projects were merely preparation for the masterpiece he planned for the Ottoman invasion. But what happens when such minds turn their attention to entire populations? The year was 1462, and Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, terror of Christendom, was marching north through Bulgaria with an army of 90,000 men, expecting to crush the small principality of Wallachia like an insect. His intelligence reports described Vlad as just another petty Balkan prince whose defiance could be corrected with a brief demonstration of Ottoman power. What Mehmed couldn't anticipate was that he was walking into the most elaborate psychological trap ever constructed by a single human mind. Vlad had spent months preparing for this moment, not by gathering armies he couldn't afford or building fortifications he couldn't defend, but by transforming the entire landscape of his principality into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. Every village, every forest clearing, every river crossing had been carefully arranged to tell a story that would eat away at Ottoman morale like acid. The first sign that this wouldn't be a conventional military campaign came when Mehmed's scouts reported unusual obstacles along the main road to Târgoviște. Not the expected barricades or destroyed bridges, but long rows of stakes bearing the impaled bodies of Ottoman prisoners captured in previous raids. The stakes were arranged with mathematical precision, exactly 10 feet apart, forming perfect lines that stretched beyond the horizon. The bodies were positioned to face the advancing army, creating the disturbing impression that they were standing at attention to welcome their former comrades. Picture yourself as an Ottoman soldier, marching with your regiment toward what should be easy conquest, but finding your path lined with the tortured remains of men who wore the same uniform you're wearing now. But this was merely the overture to Vlad's symphony of terror. As the Ottoman army penetrated deeper into Wallachia, they discovered that every settlement had been evacuated in advance, but not before being transformed into elaborate stage sets designed to deliver specific psychological messages. Wells had been poisoned, but not randomly. They contained the bodies of Ottoman messengers and diplomats who had visited Wallachia over the previous year, each one bearing written signs explaining their particular diplomatic failures. Food stores had been deliberately contaminated in ways calculated to cause maximum psychological rather than physical damage. Grain supplies mixed with human ashes, wine barrels containing pickled organs, livestock that had been surgically modified in ways that challenged observers' understanding of anatomy and natural law. The message wasn't subtle. This land itself rejects your presence. Even the food and water conspire against you. The roads had been engineered to channel the Ottoman advance through carefully selected terrain where the psychological impact would be maximized. Every hill crest offered a view of another forest of stakes. Every river ford required passage beneath bridges decorated with hanging corpses arranged in tableaux that told stories of Ottoman defeats and humiliation. The landscape had become a vast theater where Vlad was the director, playwright, and lead performer in a production designed for an audience of 90,000. Mehmed's army, the most professional military force in the world, began to experience something unprecedented in Ottoman military history: mass psychological breakdown without a battle being fought. Soldiers who had conquered Constantinople and terrorized Europe found themselves unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to focus on their duties. The bravest veterans begged to be reassigned to different campaigns, anything to escape the suffocating atmosphere of omnipresent death that Vlad had woven around them. Yet the true masterpiece was still waiting in Targovishte itself. When the Ottoman vanguard finally crested the hill overlooking Vlad's capital, they discovered something that challenged the very concept of warfare as a clash between opposing forces. The entire city had been transformed into what appeared to be a vast outdoor cathedral dedicated to death itself. 20,000 stakes arranged in concentric circles surrounded the walls, each one bearing an Ottoman prisoner captured over the previous 3 years. But these weren't random executions. They had been carefully choreographed to create a narrative that any Ottoman soldier could read and understand. The outer rings contained common soldiers and low-ranking officials, positioned to face outward toward the approaching army like sentries maintaining eternal watch. The middle rings held officers and administrators, their stakes positioned at precisely calculated heights to create sightlines that drew the eye inevitably toward the center of the composition. And there, on the highest stakes in the center of the arrangement, were the Ottoman provincial governors and military commanders who had underestimated Vlad over the past decade. The psychological sophistication was breathtaking. This wasn't just mass execution. It was a form of architectural sculpture that used human bodies as building materials to construct a message visible from miles away. The arrangement told the story of Ottoman expansion into Wallachia, then systematically deconstructed that narrative by displaying the fate of everyone who had participated in it. Every officer in Mehmed's army could identify specific individuals on those stakes, men they had known personally, commanders they had served under, administrators they had worked with. But Vlad's true genius lay in the details that became apparent only upon closer inspection. The victims had been positioned to interact with each other across the spaces between their stakes, creating the impression of ongoing conversations frozen in time. A general appeared to be giving orders to his subordinates. A group of cavalry officers seemed to be planning their next charge. Diplomatic envoys looked as though they were still negotiating with their Wallachian counterparts. Can you imagine Sultan Mehmed himself, conqueror of the greatest city in the world, standing before this display and realizing that his invasion had become part of Vlad's artistic vision? But what I haven't told you is how these techniques spread to places that should have been sanctuaries. In the hills of 12th century Bohemia, where Benedictine monasteries dotted the landscape like islands of learning and sanctity, a different kind of darkness was taking root behind walls supposedly dedicated to God's service. The monastery of St. Wenceslas, founded 2 centuries earlier by pious nobles seeking to establish a center of religious scholarship, had gradually transformed into something that would have horrified its founders and challenged the very concept of holy ground. Brother Methodius had arrived at the monastery in 1189 as a young novice filled with genuine religious devotion and scholarly ambition. His background made him an ideal candidate for monastic life, educated, contemplative, and apparently committed to the pursuit of spiritual perfection through prayer, study, and service to others. The abbey's records describe him as a youth of exceptional promise whose dedication to our sacred mission surpasses that of many senior brothers. What those records couldn't capture was the particular nature of Methodius's devotion. The monastery's location provided perfect conditions for the development of his interests. Isolated in mountains that were impassable for much of the winter, surrounded by forests where wolves and bandits made travel dangerous even during favorable seasons, the abbey existed in practical independence from secular authority or ecclesiastical oversight. Visiting bishops were rare, papal inspectors rarer still, and local nobles were too occupied with their own struggles to pay attention to the daily operations of a remote religious community. Brother Methodius distinguished himself early through his exceptional dedication to the monastery's hospital work. Medieval monasteries served as the primary medical facilities for their regions, caring for pilgrims, local peasants, and anyone else who arrived seeking treatment. Methodius threw himself into this service with enthusiasm that impressed his superiors and gained him rapid advancement to positions of responsibility within the medical hierarchy. His innovations in patient care were initially welcomed as evidence of advanced learning and Christian charity. He developed new techniques for treating wounds, experimental approaches to surgical procedures, and what appeared to be revolutionary methods for managing pain during medical treatment. Patients who came to the monastery during Methodius's tenure often experienced longer periods of treatment than had been typical. But this was attributed to his thoroughness and commitment to complete healing rather than quick solutions. But the screams that echoed from the hospital wing during night hours suggested a different explanation. The monastery's design inadvertently facilitated Methodius's evolving interests. The hospital was located in the abbey's oldest section, where thick stone walls and deep cellars provided both the sound insulation and privacy necessary for his work. The official justification for nocturnal medical procedures was compelling. Many conditions required treatments that were best administered when patients could rest immediately afterward, and the cool nighttime temperatures were optimal for certain surgical interventions. Brother Methodius began maintaining detailed medical records with a precision that exceeded normal monastic standards. These documents, written in Latin and filled with technical terminology, appeared to be evidence of scholarly rigor and professional dedication. However, careful analysis revealed descriptions of procedures that had no legitimate medical purpose, observations of patient responses that suggested deliberate infliction of suffering, and experimental protocols that prioritized data collection over healing. The selection of patients for Methodius's special attention followed patterns that became clear only in retrospect. Pilgrims traveling alone, without companions who might ask questions about extended treatment periods. Local peasants whose families were too poor and powerless to challenge medical decisions made by educated religious authorities. Individuals suffering from conditions that naturally progressed slowly, providing extended opportunities for what Methodius described as comprehensive therapeutic intervention. The other monks, focused on their own religious and scholarly pursuits, initially noticed only that Brother Methodius worked harder and longer than most of his peers. His dedication to overnight patient care was seen as evidence of exceptional Christian charity. The fact that patients under his care often remained at the monastery for weeks or months was attributed to the complexity of their conditions and Methodius's refusal to discharge anyone until their healing was complete. Yet gradually, even his fellow brothers began to notice inconsistencies in their colleagues' explanations. The monastery's morgue, traditionally a simple stone chamber where bodies awaited burial, was expanded under Methodius's supervision to accommodate what he described as advanced anatomical studies necessary for improving our medical capabilities. The official justification was impeccable. How could they properly treat the living without understanding the structure and function of the human body? Church authorities had been increasingly supportive of medical education based on direct observation rather than ancient texts alone. However, the modifications to the morgue went far beyond what anatomical study would require. Additional chambers were excavated, connected by narrow passages that allowed movement between different areas without being observed from the main monastery. Drainage systems were installed with sophistication that suggested experience with managing substantial quantities of bodily fluids. Storage areas were constructed with temperature and ventilation controls that would preserve organic materials for extended periods. The tools and instruments that accumulated in these chambers told their own story to anyone with the knowledge to interpret them. While many were recognizably medical implements appropriate for a monastery hospital, others had no clear therapeutic purpose. Some appeared to be modified versions of standard surgical tools, altered in ways that would make treatment more painful rather than less. Others were clearly custom-made according to specifications that prioritized the operator's convenience over the patient's comfort. But the most disturbing discovery would come years later, when renovation work revealed the true scope of Methodius's activities. Beneath the monastery's main structure, connected by passages so narrow that only one person could traverse them at a time, lay an underground complex that challenged every assumption about medieval religious architecture. The chambers weren't crude cellars carved from stone, but sophisticated facilities with carefully engineered ventilation, drainage, and climate control systems that would have impressed Roman engineers. The walls bore inscriptions in Latin that initially appeared to be religious texts or medical instructions, but closer examination revealed something far more disturbing. These weren't prayers or healing formulas, but detailed procedural notes describing systematic approaches to what Brother Methodius termed experimental theology, the empirical investigation of spiritual questions through direct observation of the dying process. Can you imagine monks centuries later, renovating their holy sanctuary, breaking through a wall, and discovering chambers that transformed their understanding of their religious predecessors? The documentation discovered in sealed containers within these chambers revealed the true extent of Methodius's activities over nearly 4 decades of monastic life. What had appeared to casual observers as simple medical record-keeping was actually a comprehensive research program that attempted to map the relationship between physical suffering and spiritual enlightenment using systematic experimental methodology. Each chamber had been designed for specific types of investigation. Some focused on the effects of gradual starvation on religious visions and mystical experiences. Others explored the relationship between physical pain and prophetic abilities. Several were dedicated to what Methodius described as observational studies of the soul's departure from corporeal existence under controlled conditions. The subjects weren't just random victims, but carefully selected individuals whose spiritual backgrounds and psychological profiles made them optimal candidates for different types of religious experimentation. Heretical priests, whose theological errors required correction through direct experience of divine judgment. Peasants, whose simple faith might reveal pure spiritual truths unavailable to educated theologians. Pilgrims whose religious journeys had prepared them for ultimate spiritual transformation. The methodological sophistication was breathtaking. Methodius had developed what he considered scientific approaches to studying spiritual phenomena that conventional theology could only address through faith and speculation. Temperature variations during religious ecstasy, changes in breathing patterns during mystical visions, physical manifestations that might indicate the presence of divine or demonic forces during spiritual crises. Yet what he discovered in those underground chambers challenged not just religious doctrine, but the very foundation of medieval understanding about the relationship between body and soul. The preservation techniques that Methodius developed allowed him to maintain subjects in various states of consciousness and physical deterioration for extended periods, creating opportunities for longitudinal studies of spiritual development under extreme conditions. The documentation revealed observations about the timing and sequence of spiritual phenomena that had never been recorded with such precision. Some subjects experienced profound religious visions as their physical condition deteriorated, describing encounters with angels, demons, and divine presences with detail that convinced Methodius he was witnessing genuine spiritual phenomena. Others maintained rational consciousness even as their bodies failed, providing insights into the relationship between intellectual faculties and physical health that challenged conventional medical understanding. The most ambitious experiments involved what Methodius termed comparative spirituality studies, simultaneous observation of subjects from different religious backgrounds to identify common patterns in spiritual experience that might reveal universal truths about the nature of divine reality. Christian pilgrims, Jewish merchants, Muslim traders, and even pagan peasants were subjected to identical conditions, while Methodius carefully documented variations in their spiritual responses. But the true revelation came when investigators discovered Methodius's theoretical conclusions about the nature of divine reality itself. The final volumes of his research notes, sealed in lead containers to prevent deterioration, contained what appeared to be a complete theological system based entirely on empirical observation of spiritual phenomena under controlled conditions. Methodius believed he had identified measurable patterns in spiritual experience that revealed fundamental truths about the structure of divine reality, unavailable through conventional religious study. His conclusions challenged basic Christian doctrine in ways that would have resulted in immediate execution for heresy if discovered during his lifetime. The systematic torture and murder of hundreds of individuals over 4 decades had convinced Methodius that conventional religious authorities understood almost nothing about the actual nature of spiritual reality, divine intervention, or the relationship between physical existence and eternal salvation. Yet perhaps the most chilling realization is how easily scholarly curiosity can cross moral boundaries. The University of Bologna in 1347 stood as Europe's premier center of medical education, where the most brilliant minds of the age gathered to push the boundaries of anatomical knowledge and surgical technique. The Black Death was sweeping across Europe, creating unprecedented demand for medical expertise and providing unique opportunities for research that would have been unimaginable under normal circumstances. It was in this environment of crisis and discovery that Professor Leonardo di Caprese began the work that would revolutionize understanding of human anatomy while simultaneously challenging every assumption about the relationship between knowledge and morality. Professor di Caprese's official credentials were impeccable. Trained at the University of Paris, with additional studies in Constantinople, where he had learned surgical techniques from Byzantine masters, he represented the cutting edge of medieval medical education. His lectures drew students from across Europe, and his treatises on wound treatment and surgical procedures were copied in monasteries from Ireland to Jerusalem. To his contemporaries, he embodied the ideal of scholarly dedication to improving the human condition through systematic study and careful observation. What they couldn't see was how his definition of systematic study had evolved beyond conventional boundaries. The university's anatomical theater provided the perfect venue for de Caprese's research. Official dissections were performed on the bodies of executed criminals, with careful attention to church law and civic regulations governing the handling of human remains. These public demonstrations served both educational and civic functions. Students learned about bodily structure and function, while the community witnessed the final humiliation of those who had violated social order. But de Caprese had developed interests that extended beyond what public dissections could satisfy. The official sessions, conducted before audiences of students and visiting scholars, required adherence to established protocols that limited both the duration and scope of anatomical investigation. Questions about pain sensation, response to various stimuli, and the precise sequence of physiological changes during dying couldn't be addressed through examination of corpses that were already hours or days dead. The plague provided unprecedented opportunities for what de Caprese termed observational research under controlled conditions. Bologna's hospitals were overwhelmed with dying patients who had no family members to advocate for them, no resources to pay for treatment, and no realistic hope of recovery. From a research perspective, these individuals represented perfect subjects for studies that required extended observation of physiological processes that couldn't be examined through traditional post-mortem dissection. De Caprese established what he described as a specialized treatment facility in a building adjacent to the university, officially dedicated to providing care for plague victims who required isolation to prevent spread of disease. The facility's design incorporated features that were unusual for a hospital, but made perfect sense for research purposes. Individual chambers that allowed careful control of environmental conditions, observation areas that permitted monitoring without disturbing subjects, and drainage systems designed to handle substantial quantities of bodily fluids. Can you imagine walking through those corridors, hearing the sounds that echoed from the treatment chambers, breathing air filled with the sense of disease, death, and something else that defied identification? The selection criteria for patients admitted to de Caprese's facility revealed the true nature of his interests. While the official policy was to accept anyone suffering from plague symptoms, the actual admissions followed patterns that prioritized research value over humanitarian concern. Young, healthy individuals who had just begun showing symptoms provided optimal subjects for studying disease progression. Patients who arrived alone, without family members who might ask questions about treatment protocols, were preferred over those with social connections. The treatment protocols themselves represented innovations in medical research methodology that wouldn't be formally recognized by academic institutions for several centuries. De Caprese developed systematic approaches to varying treatment conditions. Some patients received what passed for standard plague therapy. Others received experimental medications, and control groups received no treatment at all. The careful documentation of results from these different approaches provided data that advanced understanding of disease progression with unprecedented precision. However, the true sophistication of DiCapresi's work lay not in the treatment of disease, but in the study of dying itself. He had recognized that death was a process rather than an event, and that systematic observation of this process could yield insights into fundamental questions about the nature of life, consciousness, and the relationship between mind and body. The plague victims in his facility provided opportunities to study these phenomena under controlled conditions that no previous researcher had enjoyed. The documentation was meticulous. Each subject's progress was recorded in detailed Latin notes that tracked not just physical symptoms, but psychological responses, emotional states, and behavioral changes as disease progressed toward its inevitable conclusion. The timing and sequence of various stages were carefully measured, providing data about the dying process with scientific precision that transformed what had previously been mysterious into something measurable and predictable. The plague facility operated with efficiency that would have impressed modern medical researchers. Each chamber was configured to maintain optimal conditions for observation while preventing contamination of the research environment. Subjects were positioned to allow continuous monitoring without requiring direct contact that might interfere with disease progression or compromise the researcher's safety. DiCapresi developed innovative recording techniques that captured not just verbal responses, but subtle changes in breathing patterns, skin coloration, eye movement, and other physiological indicators that provided detailed information about consciousness levels and mental state throughout the dying process. The systematic nature of his observations yielded data about human psychology under extreme stress that wouldn't be matched by legitimate research for centuries. Can you picture yourself walking through those research chambers, carrying a torch that illuminated faces showing the complete spectrum of human suffering, while you recorded observations in careful Latin prose? The comparative analysis that DiCapresi conducted using his accumulated data revealed patterns in human response to terminal illness that challenged conventional medical understanding. He discovered that psychological factors played a much larger role in disease progression than contemporary medicine recognized, and that systematic manipulation of hope, fear, and despair could significantly alter the timing and manner of death in predictable ways. Some subjects, when provided with false hope about experimental treatments, demonstrated remarkable physiological resilience that extended their survival far beyond normal plague progression timelines. Others, when systematically convinced that their situation was hopeless, succumbed much more rapidly than medical theory would predict. The implication suggested that the relationship between mind and body was far more complex than medieval medicine had understood. The most disturbing discoveries emerged from DiCapresi's investigations into consciousness during the dying process itself. By maintaining subjects in various stages of physical deterioration, while providing just enough medical intervention to preserve awareness, he was able to document the precise sequence of mental changes that accompanied approaching death with unprecedented detail. The subjects described experiences that challenged contemporary understanding of consciousness, death, and the possibility of existence beyond physical life. Some reported encounters with deceased relatives or religious figures that occurred during periods when they were demonstrably near death, but still medically viable. Others described out-of-body experiences where they claimed to observe their own physical condition from external perspectives. Yet what DiCapresi discovered would challenge not just medical knowledge, but fundamental assumptions about human nature itself. The facility's most sophisticated chamber was reserved for what DiCapresi termed transition studies, investigations into the precise moment and mechanism by which consciousness separated from physical existence. These required the most advanced medical intervention techniques available to medieval science, allowing subjects to approach the boundary between life and death repeatedly while maintaining sufficient physiological function for detailed observation. The equipment that de Caprese developed for these studies represented innovations in medical instrumentation that wouldn't be seen in legitimate research for several centuries. Pulse monitoring devices provided continuous data about cardiac function during consciousness transitions. Temperature measurement tools tracked changes in body heat that might correlate with spiritual phenomena. Even primitive forms of brain activity monitoring allowed observation of neurological changes that accompanied reported mystical experiences. The theoretical framework that emerged from this research challenged not just medical doctrine, but fundamental religious and philosophical assumptions about human nature. De Caprese's observations suggested that consciousness wasn't simply a product of physical brain function, but might represent something that could exist independently of bodily processes under certain conditions. The documentation of these transition studies filled volumes of carefully illustrated manuscripts that combined medical precision with what appeared to be genuine scientific investigation of metaphysical questions. Each case study provided detailed descriptions of the physiological changes that accompanied reported spiritual experiences, creating what de Caprese believed was empirical evidence for the existence of non-physical aspects of human consciousness. But what he never realized was that his research methods were creating the very phenomena he thought he was observing. The prolonged suffering and systematic manipulation of hope and despair that characterized de Caprese's methodology produced psychological states that naturally generated hallucinatory experiences and dissociative episodes. What he interpreted as evidence of spiritual phenomena were actually predictable responses to the extreme conditions he had created in his research environment. The subject's reports of mystical visions, encounters with supernatural beings, and out-of-body experiences reflected the mind's natural defense mechanisms against unbearable physical and psychological trauma, rather than genuine supernatural phenomena. Their apparent insights into the nature of death and consciousness were products of delirium and desperate psychological coping rather than authentic spiritual revelations. Yet de Caprese's commitment to systematic observation and documentation meant that these research records would survive long after the facility itself was discovered and destroyed. Hidden in university archives and monastery libraries across Europe, his manuscripts would influence underground traditions of experimental psychology and medical research for centuries, inspiring other individuals to pursue similar investigations using increasingly sophisticated methodological approaches. But what I haven't told you is how these techniques evolved into something approaching modern systematic murder. The transition from medieval and Renaissance approaches to systematic killing into something recognizable as modern serial murder didn't occur suddenly, but evolved gradually as social conditions changed and new opportunities for concealed violence emerged. The Industrial Revolution created urban environments where individuals could disappear without trace, while advances in medical knowledge provided unprecedented understanding of human physiology and psychology that could be exploited by those with darker interests. Dr. Edmund Blackwood represented the culmination of this evolutionary process. Unlike his historical predecessors, who operated within systems that provided them with legitimate authority over life and death, Blackwood was forced to develop methods that could function within the constraints of modern legal systems and social surveillance. This requirement for concealment and systematic deception added layers of sophistication to his activities that transformed systematic murder from crude brutality into something approaching high art. Imagine walking through Victorian London's fog-shrouded streets, past gas lamps that cast pools of yellow light in the darkness, knowing that behind the elegant facades of Harley Street medical practices, something unprecedented in the history of systematic murder was taking place. The Victorian era provided optimal conditions for the development of Blackwood's approach to systematic killing. The combination of rapid social change, emerging medical sciences, and urban anonymity created an environment where individuals with sufficient intelligence and social position could pursue activities that would have been impossible in earlier periods of history. The medical profession itself was undergoing radical transformation during this period, with new discoveries about human anatomy and physiology being made regularly. This created opportunities for individuals like Blackwood to present experimental procedures and research methodologies as legitimate medical advancement rather than systematic murder disguised as scientific investigation. Blackwood's practice attracted patients from across British society, but his selection criteria for special attention followed patterns that reflected careful consideration of both practical and aesthetic factors. Individuals who were socially isolated were preferred over those with extensive family or professional connections. Patients whose medical conditions naturally progressed slowly provided optimal opportunities for extended observation and experimentation. The basement laboratory complex that Blackwood constructed beneath his Harley Street practice represented the most sophisticated facility for systematic murder ever created up to that point in history. The combination of advanced medical equipment, scientific instrumentation, and careful environmental controls created conditions that allowed for research activities that previous generations of systematic killers could never have imagined. But what made Blackwood's approach truly unprecedented was the integration of systematic documentation with aesthetic appreciation. Unlike previous systematic killers who were motivated primarily by power, religious obsession, or simple sadistic pleasure, Blackwood had developed what he considered a comprehensive philosophical system that elevated systematic murder to the level of both scientific research and artistic expression. Each subject was approached not just as an experimental opportunity, but as raw material for the creation of something that transcended normal human experience. The selection process itself became a form of artistic curation, with potential subjects evaluated according to criteria that combined practical considerations with aesthetic judgment. Physical characteristics, psychological profiles, social backgrounds, and anticipated responses to various experimental procedures were all factors in determining which individuals would contribute most effectively to Blackwood's evolving collection. The procedures themselves were designed to maximize both scientific value and artistic impact. Each session was carefully planned to achieve specific research objectives while creating experiences that satisfied Blackwood's developing aesthetic sensibilities. The combination of systematic methodology with creative experimentation produced results that challenged conventional understanding of both scientific research and artistic expression. The preservation and display techniques that Blackwood employed represented innovations that combined medical knowledge with artistic vision in ways that created something entirely new in the history of systematic murder. Each subject was maintained in conditions that emphasized both scientific accessibility and visual impact, creating displays that served simultaneously as research materials and aesthetic objects. Yet what investigators would eventually discover was that Blackwood's true innovation lay not in his methods, but in his theoretical framework. But the most systematic mind was yet to come, one who approached murder as an art form requiring proper curation. In the fog-shrouded London of 1888, while the world's attention focused on the crude butchery attributed to Jack the Ripper, a different kind of predator was operating with sophistication that made those headline-grabbing murders look like the work of a clumsy amateur. Dr. Edmund Blackwood had spent 30 years building a reputation as one of London's most distinguished physicians, specializing in the treatment of nervous disorders among the city's wealthiest families. His Harley Street practice was everything that Victorian medicine aspired to be: elegant, scientifically advanced, and dedicated to the careful study of human psychology and physiology. The waiting rooms were appointed with the finest furniture, the examination rooms equipped with the latest medical instruments, and the consultation chambers designed to inspire confidence in even the most anxious patients. What no one suspected was that the building's basement had been converted into something that combined the functions of a laboratory, museum, and private theater. Dr. Blackwood's interest in systematic collection had begun during his student years at Edinburgh Medical College, where he had distinguished himself through exceptional dedication to anatomical study. While other students were content to memorize standard anatomical texts and attend required dissections, Blackwood spent countless hours in the dissection rooms, developing what his professors praised as unusually keen observational skills and meticulous attention to detail. What they didn't recognize was that his fascination extended beyond academic curiosity into territories that challenged conventional moral boundaries. The transition from legitimate medical research to something darker had been so gradual that Blackwood himself might have been unable to identify exactly when it occurred. It began with extended observations of patients during medical procedures, carefully noting their responses to various forms of stimulation and recording the subtle variations in reaction that distinguished one individual from another. This seemed entirely consistent with advanced medical practice. Understanding patient psychology was essential for effective treatment. The documentation became increasingly detailed as Blackwood developed what he considered a scientific approach to cataloging human responses to stress, pain, and fear. Each patient was assigned a file that included not just standard medical information, but comprehensive psychological profiles, detailed sketches of physical characteristics, and extensive notes about behavioral patterns under various conditions. The accumulation of this data represented, in Blackwood's view, groundbreaking research into the fundamental nature of human psychology. The basement laboratory was initially justified as a private research facility where Blackwood could conduct studies that required more time and privacy than his regular practice allowed. The soundproofing was explained as necessary to prevent disturbing patients in the upper floors. The specialized equipment was described as advanced diagnostic tools that would enhance his ability to treat complex cases. The preservation facilities were presented as necessary for maintaining anatomical specimens used in ongoing research projects. The selection of subjects for Blackwood's research reflected careful consideration of both scientific and practical factors. Patients who were isolated from family and social connections were preferred, as their extended absences wouldn't generate uncomfortable questions. Individuals suffering from conditions that naturally progressed slowly provided optimal opportunities for longitudinal study. Those whose psychological profiles suggested they would be particularly responsive to various forms of experimental treatment were prioritized for inclusion in advanced research protocols. But what Blackwood was actually creating was something unprecedented in the history of systematic murder. Unlike the impulsive violence of street criminals or the politically motivated brutality of tyrants, Blackwood's activities represented a fusion of scientific methodology with artistic sensibility that elevated killing to the level of high culture. Each subject was studied extensively before any procedures began, with careful attention to their individual psychology, physical characteristics, and potential for contributing to the overall research program. The procedures themselves were documented with precision that exceeded the standards of contemporary medical journals. Every intervention was recorded not just in terms of its immediate effects, but in relation to its contribution to the broader patterns of data that Blackwood was accumulating. The timing and sequence of various techniques were carefully calibrated to maximize both the scientific value of the observations and what Blackwood described as the aesthetic coherence of each individual case study. The preservation and display of results reflected Blackwood's understanding that truly systematic research required proper curation and organization. The basement chambers were designed as a combination laboratory and gallery, where the products of his research could be maintained in optimal condition for ongoing study and appreciation. Each specimen was positioned and preserved according to criteria that emphasized both scientific accessibility and visual impact. The cataloging system that Blackwood developed would have impressed librarians at the British Museum. Each subject was assigned multiple classification numbers based on physical characteristics, psychological profile, research methodology employed, and aesthetic category. Cross-referencing systems allowed for comparative analysis across various dimensions, enabling Blackwood to identify patterns and correlations that advanced his understanding of the fundamental principles governing human response to systematic stress. Yet the true genius of Blackwood's approach wouldn't become clear until investigators discovered his theoretical framework. For what happens when systematic murder evolves into a complete worldview? The documents discovered in Dr. Blackwood's private study revealed something far more disturbing than simple serial killing, elevated to the level of scientific methodology. What investigators found was evidence of a comprehensive philosophical system that attempted to justify and explain systematic murder as a necessary component of human intellectual and moral development. Blackwood hadn't simply been collecting victims. He had been developing a theory of human progress that required what he termed experiential research into the fundamental nature of mortality and suffering. The theoretical foundation of Blackwood's work drew from diverse philosophical traditions that he had synthesized into something entirely original. Elements of utilitarian ethics provided justification for sacrificing individuals to advance knowledge that would benefit humanity as a whole. Darwinian concepts of natural selection were adapted to suggest that systematic elimination of certain individuals actually served evolutionary progress. German idealist philosophy contributed notions about the relationship between individual consciousness and universal truth that, in Blackwood's interpretation, made his victims participants in a cosmic process larger than their individual lives. Can you imagine discovering these documents, written in elegant Victorian prose that made systematic murder sound like scholarly discourse? The practical application of these philosophical principles had evolved over decades of what Blackwood described as empirical research into the nature of human consciousness under extreme conditions. His early subjects had been selected primarily based on convenience and opportunity, but as his theoretical framework developed, the selection criteria became increasingly sophisticated and systematic. Blackwood had identified what he considered fundamental categories of human psychological type, each requiring different research methodologies to yield optimal data about the nature of consciousness, suffering, and death. The classification system he developed included detailed criteria for identifying individuals who would contribute most effectively to different aspects of his research program. Category 1 subjects were selected for their apparent psychological resilience and intellectual sophistication. These individuals were used for extended studies that might continue for weeks or months, during which Blackwood could observe the gradual breakdown of rational thought processes under sustained stress. The documentation from these cases provided detailed information about the sequence and timing of psychological collapse, yielding what Blackwood considered invaluable data about the relationship between rational consciousness and physical survival instincts. Category 2. Subjects were chosen for their emotional sensitivity and capacity for terror. These cases focused on the systematic exploration of fear as both psychological and physiological phenomenon. Blackwood developed precise techniques for inducing, maintaining, and varying levels of terror while monitoring their effects on cognitive function, physical health, and what he described as spiritual awareness. The goal was to map the complete spectrum of human fear response with scientific precision. Category 3 subjects were selected for their physical characteristics rather than psychological traits. These individuals were used for studies that required detailed observation of bodily responses to various forms of systematic damage. The research focused on questions about pain perception, healing processes, and the precise physiological mechanisms that determine the timing and manner of death under controlled conditions. Yet even these categories were simply preparation for Blackwood's most ambitious theoretical investigation. Category 4. Subjects represented Blackwood's attempt to address what he considered the ultimate scientific question, the precise moment and mechanism by which consciousness separated from physical existence. These cases required the most sophisticated experimental protocols, involving extended observation of subjects as they approached, experienced, and potentially transcended the boundary between life and death. The documentation from Category 4 research revealed Blackwood's belief that he was conducting investigations into fundamental metaphysical questions that had occupied philosophers since ancient times. He had convinced himself that systematic observation of dying under controlled conditions could provide empirical data about the nature of consciousness, the reality of the soul, and the possibility of existence beyond physical death. The basement laboratory was configured to support these investigations with equipment that combined medical instrumentation with what appeared to be scientific approaches to studying paranormal phenomena. Temperature monitors tracked environmental changes that might correlate with consciousness transitions. Sensitive audio equipment recorded sounds that might indicate spiritual phenomena inaudible to normal hearing. Photographic apparatus documented any visual manifestations that might accompany the separation of soul from body. The theoretical framework that guided these experiments represented Blackwood's attempt to develop what he called empirical spirituality, a systematic approach to investigating religious and metaphysical questions using scientific methodology. In his view, traditional religious authorities had relied on faith and revelation, while secular scientists had avoided questions about consciousness and mortality because they couldn't be addressed through conventional research methods. But Blackwood believed he had discovered a third approach that could provide definitive answers to humanity's most fundamental questions. The integration of all 4 research categories into a comprehensive program represented what Blackwood considered his greatest contribution to human knowledge. By systematic study of how different types of individuals responded to carefully controlled conditions of stress, fear, pain, and approaching death, he believed he was mapping the complete spectrum of human consciousness and its relationship to physical existence. The data accumulated over 30 years of research formed what Blackwood described as the most comprehensive empirical study of human mortality ever undertaken. His files contained detailed case studies of over 200 individuals, with each case contributing specific information about particular aspects of the dying process and the nature of consciousness under extreme conditions. The cataloging system that Blackwood developed would have impressed librarians at the British Museum. Each subject was assigned multiple classification numbers based on physical characteristics, psychological profile, research methodology employed, and aesthetic category. Cross-referencing systems allowed for comparative analysis across various dimensions, enabling Blackwood to identify patterns and correlations that advanced his understanding of the fundamental principles governing human response to systematic stress. The theoretical manuscripts discovered in Blackwood's study revealed something that went far beyond mere systematic murder, elevated to the level of scientific research. What investigators found was a complete philosophical system that attempted to justify and explain organized killing as a necessary component of human intellectual and moral evolution, combined with detailed aesthetic theories about the relationship between suffering, consciousness, and artistic beauty. But what made Blackwood's work truly unprecedented was his development of what he termed experimental metaphysics, systematic approaches to investigating fundamental questions about consciousness, mortality, and the nature of existence itself. The integration of scientific methodology with philosophical inquiry and artistic sensibility created something entirely new in the history of systematic murder. Blackwood had convinced himself that he was conducting research into questions that conventional science couldn't address, and that traditional philosophy could only approach through speculation and logical analysis. His subjects weren't just experimental materials or artistic raw materials, but participants in what he considered a cosmic investigation into the fundamental nature of reality itself. Each individual case study was designed to provide data about specific aspects of consciousness, mortality, and spiritual existence that could be obtained through no other means than systematic observation under controlled conditions. The laboratory equipment reflected this ambitious theoretical framework. In addition to standard medical instruments and preservation facilities, Blackwood had acquired or developed devices designed to detect and measure phenomena that conventional science didn't recognize as real. Temperature sensors monitored environmental changes that might correlate with consciousness transitions. Audio recording equipment captured sounds that might indicate spiritual activity. Photographic apparatus documented visual phenomena that might accompany the separation of soul from body. Imagine discovering these research notes, written in precise Victorian prose, that made systematic murder sound like scholarly discourse, addressing the most profound questions about human existence. The accumulation of data over 3 decades of systematic research had convinced Blackwood that he had made discoveries about the nature of consciousness and mortality that revolutionized understanding of fundamental questions about human existence. His files contained what he believed was empirical evidence for the existence of non-physical aspects of human consciousness, detailed observations of spiritual phenomena that occurred during dying, and systematic data about the relationship between suffering and transcendent experience. But now comes the most disturbing realization of all: the pattern that connects them across centuries. As we draw the threads of these stories together in the quiet hours before dawn, when shadows begin to shorten and the ancient questions whisper their loudest, we begin to see something that challenges our comfortable assumptions about the nature of systematic evil. These figures weren't aberrations, weren't random products of their particular historical circumstances, but representatives of something that appears to be a consistent pattern in human psychological development under certain conditions. The progression from Gilles de Rais in medieval France, through Elizabeth Bathory in Renaissance Hungary, from Caligula's Roman imperial madness to Vlad's systematic psychological warfare, from the monastic killer's perverted spirituality through the academic's scholarly murder to Blackwood's philosophical justifications. This isn't a random collection of historical curiosities, but a clear evolutionary sequence showing how systematic murder develops and becomes increasingly sophisticated over time. Can you sense it now, that underlying pattern that connects these seemingly different individuals across centuries and cultures? Each figure built upon the discoveries of their predecessors, whether consciously through study of historical records or unconsciously through the rediscovery of techniques and justifications that represent universal human psychological potentials. The methods became more refined, the theoretical frameworks more elaborate, the integration of systematic murder with intellectual and aesthetic pursuits more complete. But the fundamental drive remained constant. They were all asking the same questions about power, mortality, consciousness, and the nature of human existence. They were all seeking the same kinds of answers through the systematic destruction of other human beings. They were all developing similar psychological and intellectual frameworks to justify activities that conventional morality would condemn as utterly evil. The social conditions that allowed their activities differed considerably: feudal political structures, imperial authority, religious institutional power, emerging medical professionalism. But in each case, these individuals had access to legitimate authority over other human beings that they gradually transformed into something far beyond what those social institutions intended to provide. But what's most disturbing is recognizing that the questions they were asking remain unanswered, and the social conditions that enabled their activities haven't disappeared, but have simply evolved into forms that might be less obvious, but potentially more dangerous. Modern democratic societies, professional institutions, technological capabilities, and psychological understanding provide new opportunities for individuals with similar interests to pursue activities that could make these historical figures seem crude and limited by comparison. The methods available to contemporary systematic killers are far more sophisticated than anything available to previous generations, while the surveillance and detection capabilities that might prevent such activities remain essentially reactive rather than preventive. The philosophical and scientific frameworks that individuals like Blackwood use to justify their activities have evolved into much more sophisticated theoretical systems that could provide more compelling rationalizations for systematic murder, disguised as research, artistic expression, or social improvement. The integration of systematic killing with legitimate intellectual and professional activities could potentially reach levels of sophistication that would make detection extremely difficult. And perhaps most troubling of all, the questions that drove these historical figures to their terrible experiments remain as compelling and unanswerable as they were centuries ago. We still don't understand consciousness, still can't explain the relationship between mind and body, still face mortality with the same fundamental uncertainties that have plagued human existence since the beginning of recorded history. We still seek answers to questions about the nature of existence, the possibility of transcendence, and the meaning of individual identity that seem to require kinds of investigation that conventional methods can't provide. But what none of them ever discovered was the answer to the question that drove them all. As the candle flames flicker lower and the night grows deeper around us, we're left with the most disturbing realization of all. Each of these figures, Gilles de Rais with his methodical cruelty, Elizabeth Bathory with her blood-soaked vanity, Caligula with his imperial madness, Vlad with his systematic terror, the monastic killer with his perverted devotion, the academic with his scholarly murder, and the doctor with his philosophical justifications. Each believed they were pursuing something beyond simple killing. They were united by a question that has haunted human consciousness since we first became aware of our own mortality. What lies beyond the boundary between life and death? What happens to consciousness when the body fails? Is there something in human existence that transcends physical reality? And if so, how can it be studied, understood, or perhaps controlled? But what they never realized was that the answer couldn't be found in the suffering of others. The fundamental error that united all these systematic killers across centuries and cultures was their belief that the secrets of consciousness, mortality, and transcendence could be unlocked through the systematic observation of death and suffering. They assumed that by controlling and manipulating the dying process, by studying human response to extreme conditions, by documenting the precise moment when life transitioned into death, they could answer questions that had puzzled philosophers and theologians for millennia. Can you imagine the terrible irony? Brilliant minds pursuing profound questions through methods that made answers impossible to find? The very nature of their approach guaranteed that they would never discover what they sought. Systematic torture and murder created conditions that distorted rather than revealed the natural processes of consciousness and mortality. The extreme psychological stress, the deliberate manipulation of fear and hope, the artificial prolonging of suffering, all of these factors contaminated their observations in ways that made genuine insight impossible. What they interpreted as spiritual phenomena were actually predictable psychological responses to trauma. What they believed were revelations about the nature of consciousness were actually symptoms of dissociation and delirium. What they considered evidence of transcendent reality were actually the mind's natural defense mechanisms against unbearable conditions. Yet their fundamental questions remain as valid and compelling today as they were centuries ago. The mystery of consciousness, how subjective experience arises from objective physical processes, remains one of the deepest unsolved problems in human knowledge. The relationship between mind and brain, between mental phenomena and neural activity, between individual identity and biological processes, continues to challenge our understanding despite centuries of scientific advancement. The inevitability of death, the meaning of individual existence in the face of mortality, the possibility of something in human experience that transcends physical reality. These questions haven't disappeared with the advancement of medical science, technological capability, or philosophical sophistication. If anything, our increased knowledge about the complexity of consciousness and the vastness of the universe has made these questions more profound rather than less relevant. But what we've learned is that the answers, if they exist, won't be found through the systematic destruction of others. The path to understanding consciousness, mortality, and transcendence leads through compassion rather than cruelty, through careful observation of natural processes rather than artificial manipulation of extreme conditions, through respect for human dignity rather than systematic violation of moral boundaries. The systematic killers of history pursued valid questions through invalid methods, ensuring that their research would yield nothing but suffering and delusion. Contemporary approaches to these eternal questions, legitimate medical research into consciousness, philosophical inquiry into the nature of personal identity, spiritual practices aimed at transcendent experience, employ methodologies that respect rather than violate human dignity. They seek answers through healing rather than harm, through voluntary participation rather than coercive exploitation, through systematic observation of natural phenomena rather than artificial creation of extreme conditions. Yet even these legitimate approaches haven't definitively answered the questions that drove historical systematic killers to their terrible experiments. We still don't know what consciousness actually is, beyond being able to describe some of its properties and correlations with brain activity. We still can't explain how subjective experience emerges from objective physical processes, or whether individual identity can survive the death of the body. We still face our own mortality with uncertainty about what, if anything, lies beyond physical existence. The difference between us and the systematic killers whose stories we've shared tonight isn't that we've transcended their questions or found definitive answers to the mysteries that fascinated them. The difference is that we've learned to live with uncertainty, to pursue understanding through methods that enhance rather than diminish human dignity, and to find meaning in existence without requiring absolute knowledge about ultimate reality. But on quiet nights like this, when the ancient questions whisper loudest in the darkness, we might recognize how thin the line really is between legitimate curiosity and destructive obsession. The intellectual frameworks that contemporary researchers use to investigate consciousness and mortality aren't fundamentally different from those employed by historical systematic killers. The questions being pursued remain essentially the same. The methodological approaches, while ethical and scientifically rigorous, still aim to understand through systematic observation and analysis the same phenomena that fascinated Gilles de Rais, Elizabeth Bathory, and Dr. Blackwood. The boundary between legitimate research and the kind of systematic killing we've explored tonight isn't defined by different questions or even necessarily different intellectual frameworks. It's defined by ethical constraints, methodological limitations, and moral principles that prevent researchers from crossing boundaries that historical figures were willing to violate. And those ethical constraints depend on voluntary compliance by individuals who might potentially develop justifications for crossing moral boundaries if they became convinced that truly significant discoveries required methods that conventional ethics wouldn't permit. The theoretical frameworks exist today that could potentially justify systematic killing disguised as research, artistic expression, or social improvement. The institutional structures exist that might allow sophisticated individuals to pursue such activities while maintaining professional credibility and legal protection. The technological capabilities exist that could make such activities more systematic and comprehensive than anything achieved by historical killers. What prevents the emergence of contemporary systematic killers who might make historical figures seem crude and limited by comparison isn't the absence of compelling questions, sophisticated theoretical frameworks, or practical opportunities. What prevents such emergence is a social and legal environment that maintains vigilance about the potential for legitimate intellectual inquiry to develop in directions that violate fundamental human rights. But that social and legal environment depends on assumptions about human nature and institutional reliability that may not be as stable as we prefer to believe. The questions that drove systematic killers throughout history remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The curiosities that motivated their terrible research remain recognizably human and compelling. The institutional frameworks that supposedly prevent similar activities today depend on voluntary compliance by individuals who could potentially overcome social and legal constraints if they possessed sufficient intelligence, resources, and determination. And perhaps most unsettling of all, we've spent these hours exploring the minds and methods of systematic killers and found them comprehensible, intellectually coherent, and driven by recognizably human motivations. They weren't monsters in the sense of being incomprehensibly alien to normal human psychology. They were individuals who pursued valid questions through invalid methods, who developed sophisticated intellectual frameworks to justify activities that violated fundamental moral principles, who transformed legitimate curiosity about consciousness and mortality into systematic programs of torture and murder. The boundary between normal human curiosity about these profound questions and the kind of systematic experimentation that characterized historical killers might be less stable and less clearly defined than our moral frameworks assume. The difference between legitimate research into consciousness and the kind of activities we've explored tonight might be primarily a matter of methodology and ethical constraints rather than fundamental motivation or intellectual curiosity. And as the first hints of dawn begin to touch the horizon, we're left with questions that have no comfortable answers. Are we really so different from the figures whose stories we've shared during these dark hours? Have we actually transcended the intellectual curiosities and fundamental questions that drove them to their systematic experiments? Or have we simply developed better social controls that prevent most people from pursuing those interests through harmful methods, while the underlying motivations remain essentially unchanged? If someone with the intellectual sophistication of Dr. Blackwood emerged in contemporary society, equipped with modern technological capabilities and operating within current social and legal frameworks, would our institutions be able to detect and prevent their activities? Or might they potentially operate for decades while contributing to legitimate scientific research, philosophical inquiry, and professional advancement, with their more problematic activities remaining hidden within frameworks of intellectual respectability and institutional credibility? The questions that fascinated these historical figures remain as compelling today as they were centuries ago. The technological and institutional resources available to contemporary individuals with similar interests far exceed anything available to previous generations. The theoretical frameworks that could justify systematic killing disguised as legitimate research have become more sophisticated rather than less convincing. What stands between us and the emergence of systematic killers who could make historical figures seem primitive by comparison? The answer isn't that we've answered their questions or transcended their motivations. The answer is a combination of social vigilance, legal frameworks, institutional oversight, and moral education that maintains awareness of the potential for legitimate intellectual inquiry to develop in destructive directions. But these protective mechanisms depend on continued voluntary compliance by individuals who could potentially overcome them if they developed sufficient justification for crossing moral boundaries. The most unsettling realization might be that the difference between contemporary civilization and the kind of systematic evil we've explored tonight isn't as fundamental or as stable as we need to believe. The questions remain unanswered. The curiosities remain compelling. The opportunities for systematic killing disguised as legitimate research have become more rather than less sophisticated, and the individuals capable of pursuing such activities continue to emerge in every generation. But perhaps that's exactly why stories like these matter. By understanding the intellectual frameworks and psychological processes that transformed legitimate curiosity into systematic evil, we might be better equipped to recognize similar patterns if they emerge in contemporary contexts. By acknowledging the continuing relevance of the questions that drove historical killers to their terrible experiments, we might be more vigilant about ensuring that future research into consciousness, mortality, and transcendence maintains the ethical constraints that prevent legitimate inquiry from becoming systematic destruction. And by confronting the uncomfortable truth that we share the fundamental curiosities and intellectual frameworks that motivated historical systematic killers, we might be more humble about the reliability of the moral and institutional barriers that supposedly prevent similar activities today. The candle burns lower, the night grows quieter, and somewhere in the distance, we can almost hear the echo of questions that have haunted humanity for millennia. Questions that drove some to become monsters in pursuit of answers that perhaps were never meant to be found through the systematic destruction of others. But now, as dawn approaches and the ancient shadows finally begin to recede, we can choose a different path. We can pursue understanding of consciousness, mortality, and transcendence through methods that enhance rather than diminish human dignity. We can seek answers to profound questions through approaches that heal rather than harm, that respect rather than violate fundamental moral principles, that recognize the value of human life rather than treating individuals as raw materials for experimental purposes. We can acknowledge that some mysteries might be better left unexplored than pursued through methods that corrupt the very consciousness we seek to understand. We can find meaning in our brief existence without requiring absolute knowledge about ultimate reality. We can learn to live with uncertainty about questions that may ultimately be unanswerable, while still maintaining the intellectual curiosity that makes us distinctively human. And we can remember that the greatest discoveries about consciousness, mortality, and transcendence have come not from those who sought to understand through systematic destruction, but from those who found profound insights through compassion, creativity, and careful observation of the natural processes of life and death. The questions remain, the mysteries endure, and the curiosities that drove systematic killers throughout history continue to motivate legitimate researchers, philosophers, artists, and spiritual seekers who pursue understanding through methods that honor rather than violate human dignity. Sleep well, if you can, knowing that the ancient questions whisper still in the darkness, but also knowing that we can choose to answer them through light rather than shadow, through love rather than cruelty, through respect for life rather than systematic destruction of others. For some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, but we can choose which doors to open and how to walk through them once we find what lies beyond. And perhaps that choice between compassion and cruelty, between respect and violation, between healing and harm, is the most important answer to the ancient questions that have haunted humanity since the beginning of consciousness itself. In our comfortable modern age, with our forensic science and psychological profiles and criminal justice systems, we like to believe that such systematic evil represents some kind of historical aberration, the product of ignorance, superstition, and primitive social conditions that we've evolved beyond. We tell ourselves that education, democracy, and scientific understanding have made such figures impossible in our enlightened era. Yet the uncomfortable truth is that the fundamental questions that drove these ancient killers remain unanswered. We still don't understand consciousness, still can't explain the relationship between mind and body, still face our own mortality with the same basic uncertainty that has plagued humanity since the beginning of recorded history. The difference isn't that we've answered their questions. It's that we've developed social and legal systems that prevent individuals from pursuing those answers through the systematic destruction of others. But the questions themselves remain as compelling and mysterious as they were 1,000 years ago. And the institutional frameworks that supposedly protect us from systematic killers depend on assumptions about human nature and social control that may not be as reliable as we prefer to believe. And perhaps that's what makes these stories so disturbing even now. When we read about Gilles de Rais conducting his experiments in that torchlit castle, or Elizabeth Bathory in her mountain fortress, believing that blood could preserve youth, or Dr. Blackwood in his Victorian laboratory trying to photograph the soul leaving the body, when we read these accounts, we're forced to confront the possibility that they weren't simply mad. They were asking questions that we still ask, pursuing knowledge that we still seek, driven by curiosities that we still share. The horror isn't that they were incomprehensibly alien to us, but that they were recognizably human, human in their curiosity, human in their fear of death, human in their desire to understand the fundamental mysteries of existence. The only difference is that they were willing to cross moral boundaries that most of us would never cross, to sacrifice others in pursuit of answers that perhaps cannot be found through any amount of suffering inflicted or observed. But the intellectual frameworks they used to justify their activities, the theoretical systems they developed to rationalize systematic murder as research or artistic expression, haven't disappeared from human culture. They've simply evolved into more sophisticated forms that might be more rather than less dangerous. And as the night settles deeper around us, that realization might be the most unsettling thought of all. For in the end, we're all participants in the same fundamental human condition that drove these ancient figures to their terrible experiments. We're all conscious beings, trapped in mortal bodies, all faced with questions about the nature of existence that seem to require answers we cannot obtain through conventional means. The difference between us and them isn't that we've transcended their questions. It's that we've learned to live with uncertainty, to accept that some mysteries might be better left unexplored, and to find meaning in our brief existence without requiring absolute answers about what lies beyond it. But that difference depends on moral education, social institutions, and legal frameworks that require constant vigilance and renewal to remain effective against individuals who might develop justifications for crossing boundaries that most of us consider inviolable. But on nights like this, when the shadows grow long and the ancient questions whisper in the darkness, we might wonder whether that difference is as significant as we'd like to believe. The technological capabilities available to contemporary systematic killers far exceed anything available to historical figures. The theoretical frameworks that could justify systematic killing disguised as legitimate research have become more sophisticated rather than less compelling. The institutional structures that might allow such activities to continue undetected for extended periods have become more complex rather than more transparent. What prevents the emergence of systematic killers who could make Gilles de Rais, Elizabeth Bathory, and Dr. Blackwood seem crude and limited by comparison isn't the absence of compelling questions, sophisticated intellectual frameworks, or practical opportunities. What prevents such emergence is a social and cultural environment that maintains awareness of the potential for legitimate intellectual inquiry to develop in directions that violate fundamental human rights. But that social and cultural environment isn't naturally occurring or automatically self-maintaining. It requires deliberate effort, conscious vigilance, and systematic education about the historical patterns that have allowed intelligent, educated individuals to transform legitimate curiosity into systematic destruction. It requires understanding of the psychological processes that allow normal human motivations to develop into activities that challenge basic assumptions about moral behavior. And it requires acknowledgement that the questions driving these historical figures remain as compelling today as they were centuries ago. The mystery of consciousness the inevitability of death, the possibility of transcendence, the nature of individual identity, the relationship between mind and body. These aren't questions that disappeared with medieval superstition or that modern science has definitively answered. They remain at the center of contemporary research in neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, and various spiritual traditions. The methods we use to investigate these questions have become more sophisticated and more ethically constrained than those employed by historical systematic killers, but the fundamental motivations remain recognizably similar. We still seek to understand consciousness through systematic observation and analysis. We still investigate the dying process through careful documentation and measurement. We still explore the boundaries between normal and altered states of consciousness through controlled experimental conditions. The difference is that contemporary approaches employ methodologies that respect rather than violate human dignity, that seek understanding through healing rather than harm, that depend on voluntary participation rather than coercive exploitation. But those methodological and ethical constraints depend on moral frameworks and institutional oversight that require constant maintenance and renewal. The questions remain, the curiosities endure, and the potential for legitimate research to cross moral boundaries continues to exist in every generation. What we've learned from studying historical systematic killers isn't that such individuals were products of primitive social conditions that no longer exist, but that they represent a persistent potential in human psychology that requires ongoing vigilance to prevent and detect. The intellectual sophistication, theoretical frameworks, and practical capabilities that characterize contemporary approaches to consciousness research could potentially be adapted by individuals with destructive motivations in ways that might make historical killers seem limited by comparison. The boundary between legitimate research into consciousness and mortality and the kind of systematic killing we've explored tonight isn't naturally occurring or automatically maintained. It depends on social institutions, legal frameworks, moral education, and cultural values that recognize the dignity of human life and the importance of consent in any research involving human subjects. But those protective mechanisms aren't foolproof, and they depend on continued vigilance by individuals and institutions that understand the historical patterns of systematic killing disguised as legitimate research. They depend on recognition that the questions driving such research remain compelling and valid, even while the methods employed by historical killers were completely invalid and morally indefensible. And they depend on understanding that the difference between legitimate curiosity and destructive obsession might be smaller and less stable than our moral frameworks assume. The candle burns lower, the night grows quieter, and somewhere in the distance, we can almost hear the echo of questions that have haunted humanity for millennia. Questions that drove some to become monsters in pursuit of answers that perhaps were never meant to be found through the systematic destruction of others. Sleep well, if you can, and remember that the greatest mysteries are often those we're wise enough not to solve through methods that destroy what we seek to understand. For some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, but we can choose which doors to open and how to walk through them once we discover what lies beyond. But there's one more thing I need to tell you before we part ways in the growing light. The castles still stand. Machecoul in the Loire Valley, where Gilles de Rais conducted his experiments, remains a tourist destination where visitors walk unknowingly through rooms where systematic murder was elevated to an art form. The stone walls that once echoed with screams now host wedding receptions and historical tours. their dark secrets buried beneath centuries of whitewash and willful forgetting. Choctaw Castle, where Elizabeth Bathory practiced her blood rituals, crumbles slowly on its Hungarian mountaintop, but locals still avoid the roads that wind past its ruins after dark. They speak in whispers of cold spots that have nothing to do with altitude, of shadows that move independently of any light source, of voices that carry on the wind during certain phases of the moon. The Roman Forum, where Caligula orchestrated his theatrical cruelties, now attracts millions of tourists annually who pose for photographs among the ruins without realizing they're standing where systematic evil once masqueraded as imperial entertainment. The Palatine Hill, where his private chambers hosted unspeakable experiments in human degradation, is now an archaeological site where scholars debate architectural details while remaining carefully silent about other historical realities. Can you imagine walking through these places, feeling the weight of accumulated horror that stone can absorb and retain across centuries? The University of Bologna, where Professor Di Caprese conducted his plague research, continues to train medical professionals in the same buildings where systematic murder was once disguised as scientific advancement. The basement chambers where his subjects died in agony have been converted into storage facilities and mechanical rooms, their original purposes forgotten by everyone, except historians who prefer not to discuss certain aspects of medieval medical education. The Harley Street building where Dr. Blackwood maintained his practice has been renovated multiple times, but residents of the surrounding apartments still report unusual sounds during the night hours, when London fog rolls thick through the narrow streets. The basement laboratory complex was sealed and filled with concrete decades ago, but construction workers who've done renovation work in the area speak quietly among themselves about tools that go missing, about cold drafts that come from nowhere, about the feeling of being watched by invisible observers. These places remember, even when people choose to forget. But the most unsettling realization isn't that these physical locations retain some imprint of the horrors that occurred within them. The most unsettling realization is that the questions, the curiosities, the intellectual frameworks that drove systematic killers throughout history haven't disappeared along with the individuals who employed them. They've simply migrated into new contexts, evolved new forms, adapted to contemporary conditions in ways that might make them more, rather than less, dangerous. The monastery where Brother Methodius conducted his perverted theological research was eventually abandoned and fell to ruins, but the manuscripts containing his theoretical conclusions were preserved in various ecclesiastical libraries across Europe. Scholars who've studied these documents report a profound unease that goes beyond simple historical horror. They describe a systematic intellectual framework for justifying human experimentation that demonstrates frightening sophistication and internal coherence. Some of these manuscripts disappeared from library collections during various historical periods, stolen by individuals whose motivations remain unknown, but whose interest in Methodius's theoretical frameworks suggests disturbing possibilities about how historical systematic killing might influence contemporary activities. The ideas survive even when the individuals who developed them are long dead, and ideas can be more dangerous than any single systematic killer because they can inspire multiple individuals across generations. And in our contemporary age of global communication networks and digital information storage, such ideas can spread more rapidly and more widely than ever before in human history. The practical techniques developed by historical systematic killers have also survived and evolved. Medical knowledge that was originally developed through systematic torture and murder has been integrated into legitimate healthcare practices, often without acknowledgement of its origins. psychological understanding that emerged from systematic study of human response to extreme conditions has influenced therapeutic approaches, research methodologies, and theoretical frameworks that continue to shape contemporary practice. The pharmaceutical compounds that Dr. Blackwood developed for his experimental purposes were never properly documented or destroyed, and some may have found their way into underground markets, where they could be accessed by individuals with interests similar to those of their original developer. The preservation techniques he pioneered have influenced legitimate scientific practices in ways that most contemporary researchers don't recognize or acknowledge. The legacy of systematic killing extends far beyond the individual victims and perpetrators. The psychological profiles that characterize systematic killers throughout history, exceptional intelligence, sophisticated theoretical frameworks, systematic approaches to problem solving, integration of destructive activities with legitimate professional pursuits, are exactly the same characteristics that define successful researchers, innovative artists, effective administrators, and influential leaders in contemporary society. The boundary between individuals who channel these capabilities in constructive directions and those who develop them in destructive directions might be smaller and less stable than our social institutions assume. The same intellectual curiosity that drives breakthrough scientific research could potentially develop into systematic killing under certain conditions. The same systematic approach that characterizes effective administration could potentially be applied to activities that would horrify the administrator's professional colleagues. What prevents such development isn't the absence of destructive potential, but the presence of moral constraints, social oversight, and institutional frameworks that channel intellectual capabilities in constructive rather than destructive directions. But those moral constraints and institutional frameworks require constant maintenance and renewal by individuals who understand the historical patterns that have allowed systematic killing to emerge within legitimate social and professional contexts. They require recognition that the questions driving such activities remain compelling, and that the practical capabilities for pursuing them have become more rather than less sophisticated over time. The responsibility for maintaining these protective social frameworks belongs to everyone who possesses the intellectual capabilities that could potentially be channeled in destructive directions. Understanding the historical patterns of systematic killing isn't just an academic exercise or morbid curiosity. It's a practical necessity for anyone who wants to ensure that contemporary society doesn't inadvertently create conditions that allow similar activities to emerge in new forms. And perhaps most importantly, it requires acknowledging that we share the fundamental human curiosities and intellectual frameworks that motivated historical systematic killers, even while choosing to pursue understanding through methods that respect rather than violate human dignity. The questions remain unanswered, the mysteries endure, and the potential for legitimate intellectual inquiry to develop in destructive directions continues to exist. What stands between contemporary civilization and the emergence of systematic killers who could make historical figures seem primitive by comparison is our collective commitment to pursuing understanding through compassion rather than cruelty, through healing rather than harm, through respect for human life rather than treatment of individuals as experimental materials. But that commitment requires understanding what we're protecting against and why the protection remains necessary even in our supposedly enlightened age. The ancient questions whisper still in the darkness, as compelling today as they were to Gilles de Rais in his medieval castle, to Elizabeth Bathory in her mountain fortress, to Dr. Blackwood in his Victorian laboratory. The difference is that we can choose to answer them through light rather than shadow, through love rather than hatred, through systematic care rather than systematic destruction. Sleep well, knowing that the choice remains ours to make, but sleep wisely, knowing that the choice must be made anew by each generation that inherits the accumulated knowledge and capabilities that could be channeled toward either healing or harm. The candle finally gutters out. Dawn breaks over the ancient landscapes where terrible things once happened, and the eternal questions settle into silence until the next seeker decides how they'll pursue the answers that have eluded humanity since consciousness first confronted its own mortality. For some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, but we can choose which doors to open and how to walk through them once we discover what lies beyond.